Just letting you know, councillors, we are actually live streaming now. Thank you.
Couple of minutes. Long way to go, yeah. Right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's growth and development. Try again. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's growth and development scrutiny group. Just to remind you, this is being live streamed on YouTube, although the ceiling cameras aren't working, but we've got the main camera working there up front. And also, according to the local authority regulations, people are permitted to record or film meetings, so just so that you are aware that it is likely to be on record. And if I could ask you all to make sure, like I've just forgotten to do, to switch your mobile onto mute or silent or switch it off, one or the other. And if you could remember, please, to use your microphones when you speak, so that the live stream. Okay. Right, and we have members of the committee just for the live stream. I'm Councillor Neil Clark, I'm chairman of the committee. On my left is Councillor Richard Butler, vice chairman, and the members of the committee are Councillor Barney, Councillor Cotty, Councillor Howitt, Councillor Murray, Councillor Phillips, Councillor Stockwood, and Councillor Way. And then we have the officers that are likely to be contributing. We've got Catherine Evans, Service Manager for Economic Growth and Property, Derek Hayden, Communities Manager, Tom Pettit, the Landscape Officer, and Richard Mapletop, the Planning Policy Manager. So hopefully that means we're all present and correct. So let's move on to the first item, apologies for absence, which I don't think we have any, do we? We're all
There's no apology this evening.
good. Item 2, declarations of interest. Does anybody have any pecuniary or non-pecuniary or private interests relevant to the items? Take that as no. Item 3, minutes of the meeting held on the 13th of October. May I sign those as a true and correct record? All in favour? Indeed. And action, item 4, actions from that meeting. Do we have any specific actions that are noted there?
No, nothing, everything was covered. So there was the update about figures from leisure centre usage since reopening, and then a comparison table about numbers of grants that we paid out compared to the local authorities, about information provided. Obviously, any questions.
Okay, thank you. Right, let's move on to item 5 then, which is the first of the two sort of principal items for discussion this evening. And the first item relates to tree conservation, and we have our landscape officer Tom Pettit with us this evening. So perhaps could I ask you to start off present the report, please.
Hello everyone, my name is Tom Pettit, Senior Design and Landscape Officer. Are you being started? Yeah, thank you. So this is very much a visual presentation to accompany the report, so lots of photos. So I'd like to discuss why we make tree preservation orders, give you some examples, look at conservation areas, planning and our own trees and how we manage them. And this is a good example. It's a perfect example of what a TPO tree should be. It's next to the old A453, 10,000 people used to drive past it every day. Wonderful example of a mature oak, couldn't be better. And then I think the next slide is another example of a TPO oak, a focal point at the end of the road. You couldn't get two better examples of what a TPO tree should be. And this slide really covers why we make tree preservation orders, and it's expedient in the interest of amenity. So we're looking at expedient. Is a tree at risk? Is it the right thing to do? We shouldn't really be trying to protect trees that are under good management. And then the government advice is, a tree should at least be visible from a public vantage point if we're going to protect it. So if a tree isn't visible from a public vantage point, it's a road, footpath, churchyard, playing field, it's going to be very difficult for us to justify protecting it unless there's a future risk, or perhaps there's development going to be taking place and it might become more prominent in the future. But what I wanted to do is maybe demonstrate some trees that aren't perfect examples. And I picked these following three at random. So if we go to the next slide, this is a really good example of a prominent tree, the line of chestnuts alongside the A16 Remston on the left-hand side of this road. As we look at it, are all protected. You can tell it's because of a previous development. There's a modern house to the left. Interesting on this slide is the trees on the right-hand side of the road are not protected in any way. They could be felled tomorrow. We'll be struggling to protect them. But I think we don't need to protect every tree. There's a lot of trees in the borough that are under good management, and there's no real risk of them being removed. I also think the example in the far left-hand corner of the heavily pruned tree is what a lot of people consider to be good tree management. And sometimes people look at our own trees, the trees the council maintain, and don't see things like that and wonder why we don't prune it regularly. So if we go on to the next slide, this image perhaps shows the tree looking better than it is, but I would argue this tree's got quite low public amenity value. It's to view this tree, you have to go past the power station, past the parkway station, through a marina, and then this track is private, so there's no public right of access, and it serves a dozen chalets. The only public vantage point you can see this tree is from a public right of way on the other side of the river. So it has enough public amenity value for us to justify protecting it. And we, I think if this tree preservation order wasn't in place, these trees would have gone by now because there's a lot of development pressure as these chalets are expanded and become larger dwellings. But let's not kid ourselves that this tree is important as the one next to the A453 in terms of its public amenity value. And if you go to the next slide, again, another example of the tree pulled at random. This is Home Pier Point. It's blocks. It's a country club. It's a wedding venue. The trees do have a good level of public amenity value because that Bolton Lane is a popular walking and cycling route leading back to on Trent. This tree preservation order was made in 1972 when the old rectory was expanded to create this wedding venue. So this tree preservation order has been in place for 50 years. Do we still need to protect trees from, because of an incident that occurred 50 years ago? If I suggested we reviewed this tree preservation order and said the trees didn't need to be protected anymore, would you support that? I doubt you would, because it's a bet we can only lose, but at some point they're going to come out or work will take place for these trees. But I would probably argue that the people who own blocks, we value them because they create very nice setting for the wedding venue. Also, the tree preservation order only protects trees standing at the time it was made. That's best part of 50 years ago. I don't think the tree next to that sign is 50 years old. So there is a need for us to occasionally review our tree preservation orders, make sure we're up to date. If we go on to the next slide, conservation areas. So special areas of architectural and historic interest. People living in conservation areas have to notify us about tree work. And there's three options. We can do nothing. After 6 weeks, the work can proceed. We can make a tree preservation order if we feel the trees are worthy of protection, or we can write back to them around the work and see. We can't use conditions. So sometimes people say, I don't mind that tree being removed, but I would like you to condition the replacement tree. We can't do that. We have to allow the work or make a tree preservation order. And sometimes trees are fundamental to the character of a conservation area. If we go on to the next slide, sometimes they're not. This is Fintham, it's got a unique character, but trees don't make a strong contribution to it. And I think we get into this situation, a lot of conservation areas where people are notifying us about work to trees that we're never going to protect. If we go to the next slide, at best, you can get a glimpse of trees in the back garden. We could perhaps justify protecting some, but a lot of trees are not going to be visible to the public, and we can't justify protecting them. And then we need to consider the reasons for the work. I love these trees. I really thought they were really attractive feature in the centre of Walston. But when I looked at the property, when we got a notification to remove 3 out of the 5, there was tapering cracks from the windows and doors of this property. To my mind, it was pretty clear that the trees were having an adverse effect on it. And we allowed them to remove 3, and we negotiated a reduction for the 2 furthest from the property. So we do try and take a pragmatic approach when we consider conservation area tree notifications and which trees we should protect. The red line shows the number of conservation area tree notifications had over the last decade or so. As you can see, there's a steady increase. And it's a couple of years out of date, but we regularly get more than 200 notifications a year. And that does take a lot of our time. So I'd like to sort of discuss planning as well. This is the same oaks I showed you on the second slide. And I think that there's been some concern that we've allowed the houses to be too close to this tree. I would argue that because it's in front of the property, it's never going to be blocking light to the garden. It's also due north of the property. So again, it's never going to be blocking or casting direct shade on the property. You may get in the future the branches overhanging what will become the driveways to these properties. But I think if that was to happen, a little bit of pruning wouldn't be unreasonable. And we get it wrong sometimes, or perhaps get it right on this one. This slide doesn't show how big and prominent that tree is, but it's on the junction of Wilford Lane and Compton Acres. We refused the initial application to this site, and it was overturned at appeal, and the inspector allowed the removal of that tree. Luckily, COVID, can you say luckily COVID? But COVID happened, and they decided that building a pub wasn't the right course of action, and the tree's been retained, and we've got a gym at the back of it. So, we do try and fight to retain trees, but, sometimes we don't get that support. This is the worst case scenario you can get when you've got granted planning permission. A developer with no care or attention to the trees. You've got fires, you've got materials. And this is the size of development I worry about the most. A development of maybe 1 to 5 or 6 houses. I'm not too bothered about the larger scale developments because most of the big developers play by the rules. And what people tend to find in this development of this scale is that they get the expert advice to get planning permission, but once planning is granted, they go it alone, they get the builder in, and they think they can live over the challenge. And the next slide illustrates what we're looking for. You can't see it perhaps clearly if you like, but those trees are fenced off. The fencing is still in place by scaffolding. The roots are protected by the existing hard surfacing. So there shouldn't be any risk to those trees from the construction activity. And then Rushcliffe trees. Unfortunately, we manage 3,000 trees, and quite often they're positioned on the edge of a public open space that is next to a housing development, and they're positioned on the edge of the open space. So there is conflict between residents who are affected by the trees. And we've always tried to assist them And what you can see on this tree is below the main canopy, there's a sort of small area of bushy growth. We've actually removed the lower branches in the past to try and get some early morning sunlight to the property, allow them a view out. The resident would still like more. In fact, they'd like the tree removed. But, you know, we will try and assist, but we're not going to go as far as removing the tree. And then if you go to the next slide, another example, the chap at the back of the garage complained to me about loss of evening sunlight. When he got back from work, I said, look, I'm really sorry. You know, an unreasonable loss of sunlight would be if the trees were overshadowing your garden for most of the day, an hour or two in the evening. It might be unfortunate for you because that's when you use the garden the most. It's not necessarily unreasonable. But when I went round to this side, you can see you've got two trees within half a metre of the garages. A real recipe for damage in the future. So we did actually remove the trees closest to the garage, you know, because we do try and take a pragmatic approach and assist people where we can. And there's some points to consider. So we've got this question about protecting trees. Are we striking the right balance in terms of, are we protecting trees of quality? Are they sufficiently visible? We'd like to see more trees protected. Is it preferable for people to contact us to see if trees are protected? It takes a lot of staff time, but we do get to have a chat with people and work out what they're up to. But there's not a week go by where someone says, why haven't you got this information online? People do expect to have information online. And then it goes back to that point I was just making. Are we happy to still liaise with residents, try and maybe carry out some green work to trees if they consider them to be an issue? Or will we take a more hardline stance where we say, loss of light, tough luck, we're only going to carry out work to trees if there's an immediate chance of damage or injury? I would suggest, I've worked here for a long period of time, and that's because we've always taken a pragmatic approach and tried to assist residents where we can, rather than just say, I'm sorry, we're not going to consider work to trees. So that, I hope that illustrates the content of the report. If you've got any questions, happy to answer.
Right, thanks for that. I've got some questions. I hope other people have as well. I will just kick off with one that perhaps could you, to refresh the group's memory, could you just go back to the the Wellington Avenue Newton tree? Just
The as built, bring up with the houses next to it.
Yeah. So my question, I do happen to know that very well, and I happen to know how already there's been some question about that tree being in the way, despite the fact it's been there for a hell of a lot longer than the houses have. But I believe the developers have already requested to crown lift it and take the bottom branches off. But also, does seem to be a question as to why the houses were built so close to it, because I'm fearful that in time, whoever occupies that house will be starting to say, I'm fearful of that tree falling over and caving the roof in, because I do have in mind Melton Gardens in Everalton years and years ago. I remember the houses had been built, somebody moved into one of the houses, and within a few weeks they were claiming that a very old established mature tree was potentially going to fall on their house, and would you believe they got chopped down, and we allowed it. And I thought, well, I don't understand why we seem to be allowing people to chop trees down when they are knowingly moving into a house that's just been built right next to a tree. So I suppose really my question is, and my challenge is, are we strong enough in our appraisal of planning applications in making sure that the potential for a tree needing, in inverted commas, to be chopped down within a few years, purely because somebody is claiming that it's encroaching on their house?
So I think there's a big difference between a tree that's large and within falling distance of the property and a tree that's dangerous. You know, for it to be dangerous, there has to be this degree of foreseeability. You know, is it dead? Is it diseased? Is it decayed? Is it structurally compromised in some way? This tree, whilst it's large, it's actually relatively young still. So it's only entering into maturity. It's probably got another 100, 150 years in it. There's a British standard that allows us to calculate how close a building can be to a tree without affecting the roots. This design is in accordance with the British standard recommendations. There's been very little root damage. Where those houses when they go into work, it's always hard surface. So, but you're right, people will buy a house, and the last thing they'll consider is a tree. They'll look at the bathroom, they'll look at the kitchen, and it drives me mad because they will move into the house and think, I didn't think about the tree. But we've still got to give the fact that they live next to a tree, and we've got to give a little bit of weight to their views. But because it's protected, they've got to put an application in and justify the work of that tree, and it's clearly prominent. It's in good health. I don't feel there's any argument to be made in the foreseeable future that needs to come out 50 years' time, perhaps 100 years' time, perhaps, but not in the short term. And I think being the point you made, we've got to pick our battles at planning. If that tree was to the south of the property overhanging their rear garden, I would have major concerns because you can bet your bottom dollar that we can take that tree. If it being in front of the property due north, I don't think residents are going to be affected by it, as perhaps some trees on in other locations.
Do you think because the first recommendation talks about supporting the drafting of the tree protection policy, is there something that we could include in that drafting that policy that includes giving extra weight in the planning process and the application of appraisals to ensure that the trees are future-proofed for decades, not just for the next 2 or 3 years, but the next time somebody moves into a house. In other words, it's about the layout of estates and the layout of the houses, how the roads are planned, how they account for where the trees are. So, is there something that could be included in the drafting of that policy?
I'm sure there is. Like I say, you know, trees to the south of the property or trees due west of the property are going to have a bigger impact on it because of loss of light than trees to the north and east. You know, we regularly find complaints about trees, loss of light, people are moving them. So we can look at that. But beauty is in the eye of the beholder. You know, I meet people who live next to trees that I would consider perhaps at the end of their useful life, and they're perfectly happy. I'm sure we've all had complaints from residents about young trees or trees or hedges. We think, no, that's not reasonable. So, you know, what one person feels is appropriate, other people will feel something completely different. And we don't know who can buy a property, who can say. So,
I was just about to open it up to, but you just prompted me, and it's relevant to what you've just said, just to challenge you there. I mean, trees are natural things, they grow however they want to grow. Just because a tree has not grown in a, if you like, a textbook, picture perfect manner, if it's got strange ways that the branches have grown, or even a fork or whatever, why does that mean that tree has less value? Surely it's still a living, breathing tree that's providing a good environment. So why should we view that with less value?
the legislation that covers tree preservation orders doesn't mention environment once. It's all about the aesthetics of the tree, its value. And if you look at the Appendix A, that sort of illustrates our thought process when we're considering tree preservation orders. We're looking at the aesthetic quality of the tree, their condition, the impact on the public if it was to be removed, and then we do consider proximity and effect on buildings. it's a judgment. It's a balancing act. And I suppose that comes down to that first discussion point. Where do you draw the line? Making a tree preservation order is not terribly time consuming. What is time consuming is defending a bad tree preservation order, because when you make one, people can object or appeal. You have to write committee report. People can apply, refuse it, they can appeal. And then if you've protected a tree that isn't particularly good quality, it's hard to defend work to prune it. Or if you're trying to protect a tree that's not visible to the public, are you worried about work to the tree that the public won't see? The legislation really is about significant trees that are visually prominent to the public, and it's about their aesthetics.
Anybody else like to? That's the mark.
At the back of the police station in Rushcliffe, which is going to be pulled down and half a stone, is there now a woodland protection order?
There isn't, but it's on the to-do list.
Oh, right.
Again, I have said I would review it. At the minute, the tree preservation order only protects trees standing at the time it was made. I think it was probably made in the 80s. So the saplings are protected. If we change it to a woodland order, any natural regeneration that takes place, the young trees will be protected going forward. But I think as the tree preservation order stands at the moment, it's sufficient in terms of what we're trying to decide at the planning process at the moment.
But you will be doing a woodland one.
I have promised I would.
Yeah.
I haven't done it yet, but I will.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you, Tom. That was really good. I appreciate all the photographs. I've got a couple of comments and some questions. So can I just go through the whole lot in one go and then you respond? Is that all right? So first of all, I was encouraged to see that. Well, I was upset to see we chopped down 78 trees in the report, but we planted 2,500 plus, so I cheered at that. I noticed paragraph 3.31, it talks about the processionary mob being confined to the southern counties. And I hate to tell us, I'm sure you're already aware, but I'm certainly aware of some in Kingston on Soar, where a resident of mine had a moth descend from the tree, hit him on the neck, and was quite ill actually with the rash. It has killed some of the very established mature oaks that are there, so I flagged that to you if you're not aware of it.
I wasn't.
It's really sad.
I think it's deeply worrying, pests and diseases. Look at ash. Most of the ash trees in the Bed of Beaver, all the roadside trees, I'd say probably 78% of ash. When I've been to the Lake District and the Forest of Dean, particularly in the lakes, I didn't see a healthy ash tree. There's loads of dead ones. I really do worry the next 5 years that most ash will be dead. I might be proved wrong. I'd be happy to be proved wrong, but I really feel it's going to have a huge impact on the character of the borough. And there's not much we can do.
These are beautiful oak trees. They're on the former Belfast estates. I mean, goodness knows how many hundreds of years old they are. One has already died. The other 6, they're in an avenue. Look like they will. Perhaps you should come and visit and confirm whether it is the oak procession or not. But anyhow, that was a minor point. The TPOs, I was surprised that in Rushcliffe we have 313 TPOs, which I thought seemed like quite a low number. But then I've got nothing to recompense that against. So how does that compare with other authorities? Is that of a similar ilk? Is that normal?
I honestly don't know. I know Newark and Sherwood used to protect a lot of trees. I did some work for them for a while. But you've got to remember that not each tree preservation order protects a single tree. Look at the Saxondale, that's covered by one tree preservation order, and yet the whole village, every tree there is protected. So that one protects 1,000 trees. So it's difficult to quantify.
It would be interesting, I think, that particularly as we go into this protection policy, just to have some guidance on where we stand on that in relation to other populations of similar vernacular and population. There was a picture you showed of a tree which has a TPO on it next to a river, but you said it was questionable whether it should or not. I think it looked like a large ash tree from my reading of it. Of course, it might have limited immunity value, but it has enormous biodiversity value and habitat value, particularly in that location with species such as bats, who would probably have frequented that for many years, enjoy all the bug life that's free flowing on the river. Are we considering the biodiversity value, or is it only immunity value?
We can give a little bit of weight to biodiversity value, but on its own, that's not enough to protect a tree.
I think that's very sad.
That's the government guidance. So that goes beyond my, you know, you might want to write to your MP about that.
No, it's really interesting. I've got more questions, but I'm willing to stop, because I realise I've stopped for a lot of time. here.
Why are you in full?
Are you sure, Chair? Are you sure?
Yeah.
So
While you're on a winning streak.
Well,
yeah.
my earliest memory is I think I can recall is in 1978 when I was 2. And it was my mother getting up and screaming out of a house with a heated roll was in, looking like Hilda Ogden in a dressing gown, and running it to a neighbouring property to put her arms around an oak tree that had a TPO on it, I believe, was about to be felled by the developer. And I'm delighted to say that tree's still there when I visit South Wales, where it is. I've been shown all my children that tree's there because of your grandma. But more latterly, in the last 5 years in East Leigh, there's been a huge amount of development. And there are a number of trees in East Leigh, some magnificent oaks. They're not quite as old as the ones in New Kingston, but they're probably 150 years old, and they have TPOs on them. And unfortunately, one of the developers was minded to chop them down, and they were only saved by a number of us realising, running out and doing the same thing again, whilst one of us desperately on the phone shouting and screaming to poor Andrew Pegram to take reaction measures, and the council did, and actually it's fantastic, got out, and those trees are still there today as a result. It's brilliant. But just in the last couple of weeks in Gotham, we've seen some ancient headland destroyed. Friday night, again, have nowhere to go to. I resorted to calling poor Kath Mary at 5 o'clock. What do we do? There's a badger set, there's hedgerows going. Because once it's gone, it's gone. So are we also going to look at enforcement and actually having stronger enforcement, or again, just get back to the national legal framework, what we can actually do? Because in each of those cases, we've not been able to say this. Once they're gone, they're gone. And the fines are minuscule, really, in relation to it. And then you can always plant another tree, but you can't restore an ancient tree. You can't put back an ancient hedgerow. So are we going to have any teeth, and does this serve this study we're looking at go in that direction?
Yeah, so sometimes trees aren't protected, and sometimes hedgerows aren't protected. So I think the Gotham example, the work they've done was allowed and not necessarily done anything wrong. There's a question about the hedgerow, but we are working on that. The difficult thing is we're trying to predict when you need to protect trees. And I was never aware that the site in Gotham was going to be up for development or going to be cleared. You know, hindsight's a wonderful thing. And we can do our best to try and predict and get the right trees, but there's always going to be something that comes along and blindsides you. Conservation areas are good because they do protect trees over quite a large area, but unfortunately Gotham's not a conservation area. But when we consider planning applications, we can use landscape conditions to enforce replacement planting. We've got the Environmental Act coming in, where there's supposed to be biodiversity net gain. So just because its site's been cleared, I think we can still give weight to how that site was prior to the clearance. And I don't know if that site is up for development, but I'm sure we'll find out and react accordingly when it comes into us.
I just have a feeling, and it might be a personal fiction, that it's too easy to get it. Just once it's chopped down, it's gone, and oh, well, the mitigation is with the plants and too. And I just wonder if we could look at maybe strengthening so we have a stronger deterrent so people don't do that. But anyway, I give away. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Councillor Varney, because I think that's one of an additional recommendation that we ought to be putting in to strengthen our enforcement protection and enforcement policies. And look at how we can do that. So, absolutely. Sure. Councillor Butler.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Just a couple of questions, really. Do we get many cases, we saw the picture of the road builders, do we get many cases of people who claim that they don't know a TPO is in place? I mean, I know in the greater wider world, ignorance of the law, etc., is no offence. But do we have many cases where people said, "Oh, I don't know, that tree is protected, that tree, I'm sorry, and don't tell me off to."
When we make a tree preservation order, people do tend to, well, we serve it on them when we're doing delivery. So not many people turn around and say, I wasn't aware that tree was protected. We do occasionally get sites meeting ahead of planning permission. It's not terribly common. And I think the way planning processes work these days, with local plans, identifying sites of development, pre-application advice, a lot of the applications we get, there is this ongoing discussion. But like I say, it's those smaller developments are going late. But trying to predict when someone's going to inherit a property and decide to clear the trees because they want to build on it is it's almost impossible. Occasionally we get wind, but sometimes it happens, and you're right.
Which sort of leads me on to one of the other recommendations we're talking about, and that's to do with the online record keeping. I suppose in this day and age, it is unusual for an authority not to have some sort of online record of TPOs, and I know that one of the reasons we're here tonight is to give consideration to that, as to whether we should investigate. So, with that in mind, how do we compare with other similar authorities? Are we a little bit behind the curve, or are most other authorities in a similar sort of position, wondering whether they ought to investigate online?
I'm aware the city do it, Gedling and Charnwood. So I don't think we're behind the curve yet, but with technology, if we don't do it this year, in 3 years or 5 years' time, I think we will be behind the curve. And whilst it is useful to speak to people, more and more stuff can be done online. And I think there is this ability to see stuff. People want to do it over their phone, don't they? They don't want to phone up an office at the council.
And of course, from your point of view, I mean, there's not many of you, are there? And there's lots of trees out there. So, and your colleagues are busy doing everything day to day, checking trees and responding to members and the rest of them. We're coming to you. So, I would have thought that it's in everyone's interest to really pursue. To see how this will work, how online process will work, and just as I said, it's a way of everything, isn't it? On the internet, on phones, and all the rest of it. So it's interesting to know that where we are compared to other.
Councillor White.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. President, for this report, which is quite answered an awful lot of questions, but inevitably giving rise to other questions. It sparks things in your mind. You know that my default value is to not cut trees down. We've had this discussion before. So I would do everything I can to save them, barring dangerous things, obviously. I've got a few questions about Councillor Barney, and built them all up. One of the things I was going to say is how is our tree, I used the word policy, but quite loosely, is how is it publicised? How do people know what they can and can't cut down? Which Councillor Phillips has already mentioned. The other things I have a question about the situation where trees are in private gardens, because I've been in touch with you a couple of times on some things that are in gardens, one of which ended up with a TPO, and the other one, I think probably it's too late anyway by the time I get in touch with you. But I was told you didn't take any action on things in private gardens. So I'd like some clarification on that, please. One of the things you mentioned in the report was talking about, I think it was 31, that Councillor Barnes already mentioned about the diseases and things affecting native trees. And I wonder if we should be looking at widening the diversity of species that we plant. There's been such an emphasis on native trees, which I can understand from support for other wildlife, the bats and insects and things. But we are in a time where climate change is altering what trees are surviving and what diseases they're having to contend with. So maybe we are dismissing the non-native trees and ornamental trees a little bit too lightly, because if they're grown amongst the existing trees, creatures have a chance to evolve into making those into habitat as well. This is what evolution is about, of course. And I wonder if we
have got too narrow. And I think if you look at the advice from things like the RHS, the watches, winter watch and summer programs, the Attenborough programme that's been on recently, the Green Planet, and things like Gardens World, they are all emphasising the need to diversify in terms of trees. So I wonder if we should look at widening that as well. Sorry for that, I'm dominating. I've got some lots of questions. I understand that the government policy doesn't include hedgerows. You have mentioned hedgerows a couple of times in this report, and I do think maybe we should be looking at finding a way to protect our hedgerows from cutting down by developers, possibly more than is necessary, just to expose their building site. And also the rather dramatic cutting of hedges, and you'll know what I'm talking about on Burton Road. It's been cut down almost within an inch of its life, and the hawthorn is roughly surviving, but the elder trees that were all the way down in between the hawthorn are not surviving, which has reduced a habitat for the birds and the insects along there. So I think we should be looking at some sort of policy or way of enhancing those trees. I've just got one more thing on the government thing. It says something about county councils don't make TPOs. And I'd like your comments on that. And I've recently heard that the Nottinghamshire County Council, they cut down the tree, have a very long list of replanting, and one I'm particularly interested in is way down the bottom of the list. But they are not allowing anybody else to plant the trees. So our tree warden isn't allowed to replace that tree herself. And we've been told we're not allowed to put wildflowers on their land without a licence, which will come at cost. So I'm interested in your comments on that side.
Okay,
Sorry,
so
long list.
tree policy, I mean, on our website, we've got basic advice about tree preservation orders, but we don't have a formal tree policy. So I think that's one of the recommendations of this report. And I think it would be useful for the public, for you as councillors, and for me as an officer, because I know there's a desire to see more trees protected, but there's no framework in place to look at that. We can protect trees in private gardens. It all comes down to how visible they are. So if you've got so we're really going to be trying to look at trees that are in front gardens. We could perhaps look at a tree that was visible to a large number of properties or blocks of flats and justify protection. But again, we're trying to protect trees that really make a big impact on the public. Diversity of species, to be quite correct. When we grant plan permission, we do encourage native trees on the open spaces. I'm quite happy to allow non-native trees in gardens, where they're close to properties, because then you get a much greater choice in terms of species. You can plant stuff that's not going to outgrow the location, because there's nothing worse than planting a tree and it causing a nuisance to the residents. We've got to plant trees that can grow to maturity without causing harm. And I think you're right, we do need to look at maybe expanding. We've got a list of native trees that are in character with the borough in terms of the landscape character. And we recently added hornbeam to that list. It's not particularly common in the borough, but beech is one of those trees that's going to suffer from climate change. So having something very similar looking, encouraging its use. And because we've lost ash, that was one of the main trees that we would have encouraged people to plant, 5-10 years ago. So you're right, we do need to diversify. A lot of our older tree preservation orders were made by the county council. Can they make a tree preservation these days? I'd have to check the regulations, but 99.9% of TPO is made by the borough. Perhaps if they were looking at, they do the planning policy in terms of, minerals, but I think most TPOs are made by the borough these days.
But just taking a couple of those things a bit further, I was surprised when in your presentation, and you mentioned it a couple of times since, where you say that if it's not visual to the public, tree, perhaps I'm putting words in your mouth, but basically say a tree is no value or a tree doesn't have to be protected, or the ultimate of that is saying, well, if you can't see it, you don't have any trees at all. If you can't, so you can have sort of deserts behind houses because you can't see them. So I'm struggling to understand why, just because you can't see a tree, that it shouldn't have equal value to our environment and to everywhere else.
The government advice is that to justify a tree preservation order, it should be at least visible from a public vantage point. So as government guidance, you know, we have to follow that. We can bend the rules. You know, if we felt that a site was likely to be developed, you know, a backyard development behind a property, we could protect the trees because they might have future public amenity value. But like I say, the government advice is the trees should be visible from a public vantage point to justify protecting it.
I think when you said bend the rules, I think you meant a robust interpretation of the rules. I think that's what you really meant.
You're quite right.
Just picking up on that, it has to be, the guidance has to be visible from the public realm. But I think I'm going back to sort of previous planning applications not so long ago. What about neighbours? If neighbours say can see the trees in someone's back garden, but you can't see them from the front, are they classed? Would that be classed the same way? Or would that again be down to interpretation of the guidelines?
Again, you know, when we consider planning applications, we're not trying to protect someone's view from their property. You know, people who live on the edge of a field and they know that homes are going to be built. You know, we can't protect their view. You could get a situation where a tree is not visible from a public vantage point, but could be visible to, you know, blocks of flats or a large number. And I think at that point we could interpret that it has sufficient amenity value to such a large number of properties. But again, it's a judgment call. Where do you define that? You know, if a couple of residents can view the tree, but the public can't, I wouldn't suggest we should be looking to protect those trees unless they were really quite remarkable or special trees.
And I did just want to challenge you on one other thing, the photograph of the A60 which you had up, and your comment was that trees on the left have got TPO, the trees on the right haven't, and your words were could be felled tomorrow. My understanding, and I've obviously got it wrong, is that if a tree is greater than 6 inches in diameter, you've got to be asking for permission to fell a tree.
That's only in conservation areas. So Wenston is a conservation area, which is a good case to justify conservation areas, because from the tree point of view, they are a useful way of protecting trees. And I also think, you know, we've got to trust residents. The borough is a lovely place to live. A lot of people are very proud to live here. A lot of people want to aspire to live here. A lot of residents are very responsible. So we shouldn't get too concerned that all trees are at risk. You know, I think we've got to give some weight to the fact that a lot of our residents are very responsible property owners.
Councillor Barney wants to come back.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, just I thought Councillor Wade raised some really good points with the comments about considering other species types that aren't necessarily native in light of the climate change and the need to have species that will last and outstrip these terrible diseases. I think we also perhaps should include in that looking at breeding programs and rapid breeding programs of species. Again, we should probably be less snotty than we might have been in previous times about rapid breeding succession programs to get robust tree stock in the right place. So just something else I wanted to throw in, but just on the county council comments, I just thought I should come back because I probably perhaps owe Councillor Way an apology because I was involved as the county councillor for Eastleigh in the liaisons with some of the points that Councillor Way had raised and some of the locations she would have liked to have seen some planting and some wildfire planting. And forgive me because I think we probably it's maybe my fault, But I can assure you that it's not the county council's policy to prevent planting of wildflowers and wildflower meadows on their land. Actually, quite the opposite. They're very proactive with it and are very keen to increase it. I've had some guidance just this week, which you'd be thrilled to see, about the process for doing that. What they're concerned about is people doing it themselves, and particularly alongside carriageways and highways, for two reasons. One, putting themselves at danger against the public highway, and secondly, for planting things which then might become an obstruction to the public highway. But in other villages, and that has moved on to the first inquiry I took to the council, we're looking now, and the way forward is for you to bring maps of sites and locations, which we then can take to the county for their consideration. And wherever they can, the county themselves will actively take up seeding and planting schemes. Where they can't, they will work with communities to do it as well. So I'll pick that up again with the council. Forgive me if I've got given you the wrong end of the stick in the past.
I should point out, going off the topic, but we're looking to do something similar as well. Last year we trialled a number of areas where we cut the grass less frequently, and we hope to expand that this year as well.
Councillor Wade.
Thank you. I put this box, Councillor Barney, I welcome your comments and I think I'm too interested to hear what you have to say. Oh, sorry, no, it wasn't. I'm sure you wouldn't be interested in what you have to say, and I dare say she'll be in touch very soon. And to Mr. Pettit, we have indeed discussed with you about wildflower planting, and we've embraced the no-mow policy as well, which I hope is going to continue. And I think it's up to us to try and persuade the council to come on board with that alongside the good things that Rushcliffe are doing.
Thank you. And yes, I mean, hedgerows have been mentioned in the press this week. Was Prince Philip's campaign, Prince Charles's campaign to have hedgerows not only protected more, but to develop the art of hedge laying more, etc. But I think we should be doing more to protect hedgerows to ensure that there is that biodiversity. I've got a few. I'm proposing to add some extra things. Has anybody else got any comments, questions? What I was going to suggest was that we move the recommendations, and that, as we intimated, in the drafting of a tree protection policy, we include appraisal of planning applications in terms of protecting trees on the sites. That we add another recommendation that we need to be investigating our strengthening of the tree protection and enforcement policies. And lastly, I think there's no reason why we shouldn't, as an authority from this group, write to the government, and whether it's more appropriate to DEFRA or to the local government and housing, or both, copied into our MP, lobbying them that the legislation relating to TPOs should include an environmental and biodiversity factor, and we ought to include hedgerows within that as well. I think that's if the government isn't told about these things, we don't flag it up. And if this is all part of the planning process, we need to be protecting trees and encouraging more trees to be grown and hedgerows protected. So, does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Do I have a second?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I think we've got the original recommendation for a good basis, but there's actually a point, I think, whilst we're doing this, we need to add these on and reflect what some of the points we picked up this evening. So, yeah, that's
Yeah, so that makes sense for everybody. Does it? Can I have, let's have a show of hands. All those in favour? So looks unanimous to me. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Mr. Passett, for your presentation. And keep on protecting trees on our behalf. Thank you. Right, thank you very much. Right, so let's move on to the next item, item 6, which is the provision of cycle networks in the borough. You'll recall that we, as it says in the report, we did have 3 presentations at a previous meeting in July, which were very comprehensive presentations and didn't allow any time for discussion. So therefore, it's appropriate for us to come back. And I'm going to turn to Derek Hayden, if he could perhaps give us a quick reminder and to present this report.
Thank you, Chair. So we had 3 comprehensive presentations back in July, one from Nottinghamshire County Council as the lead local transport authority, one from Pedals, a local cycling campaign group, and one from Trans, the national charity for improving cycling. The purpose of today's report is to try and move forward with some recommendations based on the information that was provided and from discussions that we had. There was a request to have a planning input, so Richard's going to just cover some of the policy items. We can then have a pause if people want to ask questions on that, and then I will try and summarise a plan on the page as a suggested recommendation for the evening. If you look at the first slide, Catherine, just to set the scene, this is a picture of the start of the Tour of Britain in 2018 in West Bridgford. One point to note in terms of the original motion, it was primarily to look at cycling in isolation. When we've gone back and done a lot of research in terms of the principles, it looks at walking and cycling, and some comments were made in the previous scrutiny regarding widening that remit to look at walking and cycling opportunities. So the recommendation will look at both of those aspects in terms of the banner page. But I'll will pass over to Richard to cover the policy points and then pick up at the end.
Yeah, thank you, Derek. Yeah, just a very quick sort of background to the policy situation. National Planning Policy Framework produced by the government is sort of the key document for us in respect of local planning requirements as related to walking and cycling. Very much promote the fact that walking and cycling should be a sort of key thing that we take to achieve through planning policy and planning application decisions in respect of development. The key driver for that is to increase active travel and with that to promote healthier lifestyles for residents and members of the community. And the other key sort of driver behind the promotion of walking and cycling is to promote sustainable transport, to get more people walking and cycling, to reduce reliance on cars, and then in turn reduce the need for new road infrastructure primarily. One of the key things that the MPPF sort of sets out to us as the planning authority is we have to take account of the cycling and walking strategies that are prepared by the county council. I think as Derek referred to, you had a presentation on that sort of things last time. So very much see what they're doing, dovetail with what they're doing, and make sure the two are complementary with each other. A particular document also in addition to the MPPF that I referred to is a new document, well relatively new, July 2020. It's called Local Transport Note 120 that concerns cycling infrastructure design. Sets out a number of detailed requirements in that in respect of what cycling infrastructure should achieve, both in respect of new road developments, but also in respect of new housing developments, for instance. So it very much identifies new developments as good primary opportunities to achieve new and improved facilities for cycling and walking. Promotes very much that we should look to linking new developments with existing networks so that it also feeds through, it's connected, and not sort of good facilities in that new development
and then the end at the end of the scheme. So a lot of sort of detailed background, best practice in terms of what we should look to achieve on new development sites. Yeah, in terms of where we are at the moment in respect to planning policy, working from those national requirements, the key policy for us is our core strategy policy 14 on managing travel demand. A number of very sort of broad requirements as related to new developments within Rushcliffe. So we already set out that any new sites that are put forward for development should be in locations that are accessible to cycling and walking and public transport, or could be made accessible in the future. So those sorts of locations should be the priority for development. The idea is that cycling and walking, as always intimated, should be prioritised above other measures before we look to increase road capacity. So we do already set that out in policy 14. And then in respect of any new facilities that we require through the plan process and through development decisions, the priority should be to achieve those facilities early on in the build out of new developments. So they're not there at the end of the process, they are there from the start. So that is an explicit requirement. In addition to policy 14, we do have a number of site-specific, a number of site-specific policies in the plan, particularly for civic sites where there are detailed requirements in the things we ask for in respect to cycling and walking. So, for instance, I think I mentioned in the report at Walton and the Melton Road development. So the requirement there is that there should be improvements both within the site and, as you know, we're meant to see also linkages with the existing routes around Walton and further beyond. Thank you, Richard. Next slide, please. So what I have tried to do in terms of from the two sessions we've had on this is to produce a plan on the page which has been appended to the papers this evening, which promotes 3 priority outcomes which we wish to achieve moving forward. One is promotion, and there's some activity that we do already, but it's really to increase the promotion of walking and cycling as a thing that all residents of the borough are encouraged to do. We do events like Dr. Bike, where he repairs bicycles at events. We have pedal power sound at our community events, and really to integrate walking and cycling as a part of the promotion of the work that we do. The second priority is safety. You'll see that there's been issues with bicycle theft and visibility, and we had some comments in the previous session regarding cycling and walking safety and visibility and the promotion of those activities. You'll see in the press over the recent weeks that there's been some changes to the highway code, particularly around walking and cycling, and we can do positive promotion and reinforcing those safety messages within those changes and promoting those changes. And finally, the third priority is infrastructure. Nottinghamshire County Council, as the local transport authority, will take the lead in terms of infrastructure arrangements. So what we can do is prioritise our areas for investments and work with the local transport authority in bringing forward proposals for future investment and for that we would like to promote in terms of when funding becomes available. So on the plan page, what I've tried to do is set out some success measures so we will work with. It's not an exhaustive list, and it will be added to as we go, and we will have some performance indicators which we will look to achieve. Instead of having a standalone strategy, we are also proposing that it sits within the existing leisure strategy, which is due to be refreshed in 2023, and the climate change strategy, which has been recently adopted by the council as a part of the carbon management reduction plan, due to its links to climate change, carbon reduction, and active travel. So really where I'd like to take the discussion is to really review that final page and see if there's anything that it needs to be included or incorporated and moving forward in line with the recommendations of the report.
Right, yes, okay, thanks very much for that. Somebody have any questions, comments, contributions? Councillor Webb.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to repeat my main statement that cyclists and pedestrians don't mix well. And I like to see when there's joint or side by side walkways and pathways that they're separated preferably physically. As somebody who doesn't cycle but walks, I'm feeling more danger from cyclists than I do from other traffic.
Also, can I just come on? Because that's a very good point. And also, we have a new trend growing now, don't we, with the electric bikes. And if you're a pedestrian and you're on a footpath, and you don't hear them. I mean, they're a complete nuisance in electric things, but that's just my view. And and so how we as an authority can have any control of that, I'm not sure.
One question that springs to mind from either of the officers can answer. Is anything in your presentation that is actually in conflict with the new highway code recommendations that have come out this week?
Just in answer to Councillor Ray's point, when we look at infrastructure improvements in terms of segregation, walking, cycling, in terms of shared paths, that is something that we can also work with in terms of promotion and safety, in terms of that shared infrastructure as a part of moving forward. In terms of the highway code, the changes are minimal. There's a lot of things. I think there's a lot of misinformation that's come out in recent weeks about the changes. Some of them are, for example, the primary position. I think some of the media suggested that they will be in the middle of the road, where it's when the road is narrow and that it's adopting the primary position, which is a more central area. And I think the work in terms of promotion and safety is to dispel some of those myths and educate around the changes with the highway code. So that would fall under priority outcome 1 and 2 of the plan, trying to reinforce and educate some of those changes that are due to take place. So there's nothing within what we're proposing that conflicts with the current changes to the highway code.
Yeah, I don't know how much they're myths or not. One of the, because I read one of them is it actually says, I can't remember the exact wording, but even if there is a designated cycle lane, then cyclists can ride in the middle of the main traffic lane and ignore. In other words, I'm thinking Melton Road is a great example. What the highway code apparently is now saying is you can ignore that cycle lane. Cycles should now cycle in the middle of the traffic lane as opposed to the cycle lane, which sort of renders the cycle lane somewhat useless. Is that your interpretation?
So, in terms of the highway code, it's the cyclist's discretion whether they use the cycle path or not, even if it's provided. So if they're not obligated to use a cycle path, and that can be for a number of reasons in terms of safety, in terms of they don't have the prime position is not about cycling in the middle of the lane. It's about having appropriate using due care and attention. But you are correct in terms of they do not have to use a cycle. They do not have to use a designated cycle lane. It's very small on the road.
We could debate this for an awfully long time. Councillor Phillips.
Thank you, Chairman. Okay, I mean, just carrying on from that, a lot of the cycle paths are not actually fit for purpose, and one that comes to mind is the sort of Western Boulevard, where you've got a cycle and pedestrian track there, and the roots from all the trees are lifting all the cycle paths, so you can't be bouncing over tree roots and everything else. But that wasn't my main point. Coming on to what Councillor Way said, pedestrians and cyclists don't go together. I fully agree. And most of the time, they don't go together. And part of the reason is, as a cyclist, I know you won't know it, a lot of cyclists don't have belts. And it should be law. I know when they sell a new bike, it has a bell on it, but then you can take the bell off. It should be law that that bell stays on there. Because, you know, when a cyclist comes by you, if you're walking along, they've got no means of warning you that they're coming like 20 miles an hour or whatever. And, you know, you wander into their path and, hey, you've got an accident. The other thing is, like me, I've got bells on my cycles. I ring them, but nobody moves because they've got earplugs in listening to music. So how do you get over that? You know, it needs to be a way. You know, and I think there's a good opportunity when we do the events with the police with the coding bikes and all the rest of it, where they actually check if the bike hasn't got a bell, they issue a free bell. Rather than these dead expensive bike box, you know, a bell that bought in bulk can be a few pence, you know, and we put bells on those bikes. Now, whether they keep them on or not, we've got no control until it becomes law to have a bell or a means of sort of warning people. So we're doing more and more for cyclists, and that's great, but cyclists need to be doing a bit more as well. Thank you.
That is exactly the type of initiative that we would look to address on that safety theme in terms of that share and respect between walking, cycling, and cars. Because, you know, in terms of our position, in terms of publicity about helmets are not required, cycling helmets are not required, high visibility is not required, encouraging people to be safe and be seen, campaigns, working with road safety partnerships, getting across those clear messages about if you've got a bell, use it in terms of to alert people and having that due care and attention while you are using them. And then really trying to promote people to go out into the community and to use the cycle and walking infrastructure that was there as a part of that approach.
So, well, it's not on that. Well, yes, I mean, in this plan on the page, it's vital, and you've got, I think it's right that we are so beholden to other players, other authorities, so the county council, for example, or even Highways England, or whatever they're called now for their roads, and we need to be careful whatever policy we bring in here, not to fall into the danger of over-promising and under-delivering, building people's hopes up. Because I remember when, I'm sure we all did, when we first found ourselves in this new pandemic world 2 years ago, government suddenly said, yeah, go out on your bike to go walking, and people did just that. But also, there were these great announcements made that X million pounds going to be provided to local authorities to upgrade cycling tracks and all the rest of it. But as is probably inevitable, the amount of money that was provided was really quite tiny and minuscule, and so couldn't really provide anything really substantial in the way of new tracks. So we had a situation where lots of people out there were wanting and expecting that they'll be able to get their bikes out and have nice new tracks and all the rest of the reality is that didn't happen, it couldn't happen, and I suspect it won't happen. So I think it's when we do this, we don't want to fall. And that finished up with a lot of these people coming to the councils and the authorities complaining. Well, the government said you've got to do this and you can do that, but the reality was the money wasn't there. So people felt let down and disappointed. And whatever we do, we don't want to perhaps fall into the same trap of doing this. And I don't reading this, I don't think we are, because we're making it clear that we can only do this or have our policy as a result of work done by the plants and the plants. Councillor Carter.
Yeah, thank you. A little bit of experience on that thing. And I'll just finish up what Councillor Butler was saying, the government also gave us 10 weeks to put forward our ideas, and then when we got the money, we got 6 weeks to do it in, which really wasn't ideal for anybody, because you need to consult people when you're doing these sorts of schemes. And I think the idea of the infrastructure in sites that are being developed, or of putting them forward, those ones as a priority, I agree with, because you can build it in to a new build of a site. When you go to take certain areas or certain roads to do it, you can be paying £1 million a mile for a proper cycle lane. So unless the government are going to give us millions of pounds, we need to be building into our infrastructure as we go along. And those people who, because I went to meet Highways England in my other role, when they had the Barton Favis consultation, and speaking to them about cycle lanes, and this is going back, I think, 3 years now, when they do the A52 from Whitcroft Island to Nottingham Night Island, until they come forward with their actual plans, we can't actually put in, well, I say we, I'm talking county council wise, you can't put any applications in funding. So it's a catch-22. You can't get forward with it. But I think when we're doing the infrastructure for our developments, we can start to put those things in, so we can look at working with boroughs and boroughs working with county councils to join those up. I'd like to get on my bike, because I used to ride around the villages as a kid, and I would actually ride here or to somewhere else in West Bridgeford on my bike, but I wouldn't go past the Nottingham, the Nottingham Night Island or the Whitcroft Island. I wouldn't even go anywhere near it on my bike. It's bad enough in a car. So I think it's how we get the funding and money. I think we should go ahead with policies to look at how we're going to do that. I know Derek mentioned about, we find opportunities for funding. So I have no problem with doing them. I just think it's where you both started off with the expectation that the public have on it. So I support it. I don't have a problem with it, but I don't want to see the expectations at the level they were when the government made their original announcements. So.
And as you said, on new developments, large-scale developments, then we should be ensuring that there are proper avenues and tracks to accommodate both pedestrians and cyclists safely, rather than mixing them together. And on new developments, that should be perfectly possible. I think developers have got to accept they've got to be allocating more of their land that's going to be ultimately on the public highway for these sorts of things. It's the existing road structure that is the difficulty, because in this country we have been obsessed with building such narrow roads that are only just fit to accommodate, well, not even the width of today's modern vehicles now. So we're suffering from that legacy. In other countries, they've got nice wide boulevards that they've had for ever since vehicles were invented.
We just chip back, think the e-scooter, which is rife in the city. Again, we're talking about bells on bikes. They are going to be a disaster. I know it's great fun for people who want to use them, but if we were doing cycleways and walkways, which I agree, popular should be set, but we've got the same problem with e-scooters.
Yes, yeah. At the moment, I know they're not supposed to be used on the public highway, but they're just unregulated, and I'm sure, certainly I can give you a good example, I'm sure everybody can, of e-scooters on the public highway when clearly they shouldn't be, exceeding the traffic speed limit, never mind about their own speed limit. So there we go. Just a question for, well, again, really. This plan, and when we talk about safety, is this inward looking? Is it safety of and for the cyclists and pedestrians, or is it outward looking as well? Because cyclists have impacts on other road users. For instance, there's now this fashion to have these very bright headlights, which motorists seems to be now getting obsessed with strobing and flashing bright headlights, which is a safety hazard for other road users. And unless the highway code's changed, the highway code used to say that all lights must be continuous, and a continuous light, so that you can actually identify where the cycle is. If I've got a cyclist coming along with me with a flashing light, you can't see where they are. It's just a flashing light somewhere. Whereas a continuous light, your brain can focus in and see where they actually are. So I just wanted, are we concentrating on inward looking only, or are we looking the other way as well?
It's we would, so obviously, work with the road safety partnership is to reduce collisions and accidents on the roads, but it's really there's two strands to the safety theme. One is to protect bikes and infrastructure from being stolen, so looking at cycle safety measures, bike marking, locks, the cycle storage provision as infrastructure is developed, and the other is about care and protection for promotion of using lights, helmets, high vis. I don't have any specifics. We would always encourage people to use lights in environments, but I don't have any specifics on flashing lights. Just to answer the infrastructure point that was previously made. Obviously, as a district authority, we will work in partnership with a number of agencies to identify priority projects for investment, which we would look to find opportunities to find, studies for pre-development that would then go to the local transport authority, who as the lead agency, would look to bid to government for funding and investment. So we have to remember that we work in conjunction with the transport authority. So we have an aspiration for certain infrastructure to be delivered, but they are looking from a county perspective. So it would be where, in terms of that priority list, our priority projects would fall. So it's striking that balance in terms of trying to bring those existing infrastructure projects forward. Whereas within new developments, we've obviously got planning policy and planning and development control, which can influence how those sites are developed.
Okay. Councillor Raleigh?
Yeah, I thought Councillor Cotty made some very wise comments about retrospective, trying to fit this back, but it's the right place for its context, is looking forward and what we can do in the future. I thought completely concur with what you're saying. And when I read the report and listening to you, to me, where this was exciting is in its potential applications on sites like the LDO site that a number of us have made representations on recently. And I know that in my own representations, which I made along with Councillor Rex Walker, we steered quite strongly in our views and comments on transport routes and accessibility and environmental sustainable access to that site. So I'm really confident and hopeful that this will feed in and provide real teeth and clout should schemes like that come forward to enable these infrastructural measures to be put in place, not just a lip service value, but in a real tangible way. So I think it's really exciting. I've got a terrible confession to make, and I can sense that I probably will be thrown out the chamber and will never be elected again. But e-scooters are enormously good fun, which is what I love.
Private landlord.
I love riding on them. And I actually wonder, as we've talked about it a little bit, I think one of the problems with them is that they are so much fun that they encourage you to be reckless on them just because if you get carried away with these, they're awesome. But that's a problem, and we've mentioned it several times. I'm just wondering where actually justice policy going forward. I mean, we talk about it being in the city and a city problem, but they're going to be everywhere. They are coming everywhere. They are everywhere. Are we look? Is that being included in this framework or other frameworks? Because we probably all did all think where we are on these things.
it's not included in the specific paper. The policy around e-scooters is that they're in the trial areas currently and they're not allowed to be on the public highway that are not. I understand that that's not the case because we've all experienced it, but currently that trial is within the city. But it is something that I can certainly take away and find out how we can promote safe messages around, conflicts that you have with walking and cycling and new technologies that are coming to the market.
They clearly are lethal, and there's been some horrendous accidents, of course, in the city as well. I don't want to make light of that at all. But I think we need to be on the front foot rather than the back foot, because it's a problem we're not going to be able to ignore here in Rushcliffe.
I think, as you've indicated, at this stage, it will be impossible for us to include any guidance or rules, especially, for instance, even in developing new housing development sites. It would be impossible to cater for e-scooters, because I've no doubt, well, we've talked tonight about pedestrians and cyclists being difficult to mix. I think e-scooters, is yet another complete factor to enter into a mixture of three rather than two. So I suppose we ought to be clear on that understanding. It's impossible to, at this stage, until national law is in place, we can't really include anything in this plan, can we? Right, is there just a question to the Scrutiny Group? This action plan, or this plan on the page, are there any specific queries or concerns that something's not quite right, or could we improve something, or are we quite happy with it as written? Councillor Costa.
Just being watchful of some of the wording, it says on the safety priority outcome 2, the bottom dot down at the bottom on the 1, 2, 3, 4th box down, work in partnership to support more whaling and cycling training with schools.
It's probably correct, but I just wondered if Derek had actually put it down and there's a printing error there, or a mistake.
Whaling and screeners, just to make it clear.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually, when I was reading this out, I noticed some other organisations that have been in contact in terms of the United Footpaths Preservation Society in terms of the promotion of walking. That's it's not a finalised document. So in terms of the comments, I will include those and spell check as well.
I'm happy with it, Derek, but I knew you could take me. Go on.
Very good. Well, they did find your deliberate mistake.
Well done.
Excellent. Right. The recommendations are they're almost the recommendations for this group this evening. Rather, I think the first recommendation is, from what I've heard, that we are happy to agree that walking and cycling should be included in the scope, and we're happy with this on the page. Am I correct? Yes. Yeah. Well, in fact, the second one, I think we've achieved that, really, haven't we? We've made comments. I'm not quite sure how we can actually convert that into a recommendation, other than saying that we presumably, are you looking for a recommendation to formally adopt this? And where will it actually end up as a policy? Where will it be included?
So it will form part of the refresh of the leisure strategy, because the leisure strategy runs from 2017 to 2027, and we're refreshing that in over the next period. And it will also form part of the climate change strategy, and it as a subset document of the carbon reduction action plan, because the promotion of more sustainable travel and active travel is a key component of us hitting our carbon neutral targets by 2030 and 2050. So health promotion, sustainable communities, and carbon reduction and the environment are the two parent strategies which this action plan will feed into both under each theme.
So is it fair enough if we're basically recommending that this plan be included within the measures strategy, what health strategies are of this council?
Yeah.
Okay, is that acceptable to everybody? Okay, yeah, that's unanimous. Right. Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. Thank you to all the officers for input. We now just have got the very extensive work program here. Item number 7. We've got April, next meeting in April, planning communications.
That could be read in different ways, couldn't it? Planning communications.
Yeah, very good. Yes. So the planning service communication. rather than, so at the moment, that's the only item, isn't it? So,
Yeah, and I think my understanding is that was deliberately to allow sufficient time to cover that item.
right. Yes, because it can be. Probably it seems quite straightforward, but it can be quite a comprehensive item. Right, we haven't done anything beyond that.
I think it's for June is the conservation areas item coming back.
Well, at least we know what's happening for the next meeting. Is that okay? Everybody accept that? No? Right, lovely. That brings us to the end of the agenda. So thank you very much for your attendance.